Welcome back to Young Heretics and to Words, 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 our translation series. Today, I want to introduce you to the translation cinematic universe. So I got a really fun question over Substack DMs that I think is going to pull me down to earth and get me doing a little bit of shop talk. Enough of this fancy, highfalutin, hoity-toity translation talk about the abstract nature of language and our existence as created beings. Let's talk shop. Let's talk about not just how to pick any individual translation, but how to pick a publisher of translations. If you're on the go, you don't have a lot of time to rifle through various different translators, you're not familiar with the various names that might or might not be good to go to, how can you pick a good name of a publisher or a series that might be trustworthy? So here's the question. It's from Kevin. And he says, "Dear Spencer, I have a question about translations that comes at the question of good translations in a different way. There are several different translations for classic non-English books that are a part of various collections, like the Everyman's Library. Is there any guidance on which collections give the best translation? Basically, what I'm wondering is if I don't have the background or time to compare translations, which I don't, is there a good rule of thumb, like when in doubt, go with the Everyman's Library edition, or avoid the Canterbury Classics, or something like that a layman can use to not be as overwhelmed when trying to read Beowulf, any of the sagas, or something a bit more modern, like Crime and Punishment?" So I love this idea as a cheat code. I love the thought of it. And I feel like it should work. I wish it worked a little bit better. I wish I could be more definitive about a particular publisher or a particular series. And I feel here kind of like how you always feel there should be just one video game system that you have to buy and then be able to play all the games you want to play. Or you always feel like you should be able to just download one streaming platform and be okay with that. But inevitably, there's always different shows on different streaming platforms. You have to download like 5 of them, and then you want to play God of War, but you also want to play Gears of War, and you want to play Halo, and you want to play these different games. You have to get like a bunch of different gaming consoles. And there's a similar problem in translation publishing for actually a lot of the same reasons, but you can get a feel for the lay of the land. And what I want to do today to maybe help answer this question is just give you a rundown of some of the publishers and series of publications that I'm familiar with, that I've used before, and kind of tell you what you can expect from each of them and how to maybe sift through them. And then I'm sure I'll be missing a bunch, and there's others that I know I'm missing that I'm not familiar with. So maybe if there are particular ones you want to know about or ones that you wish I had talked about, you can write in and let me know, and maybe we'll revisit and do a rundown of listener recommendations, because I would really appreciate that, honestly. I would love to know how to navigate this world a little bit more precisely. But like I said, the problem that exists in the world of video game consoles, which is that free market competition is inevitably going to produce multiple different brands. And that same problem that exists in the world of streaming that makes it impossible to like standardize everything under one heading is basically the same problem that exists in the publishing world. And it helps actually to think of a publisher as a brand, because that's really what it is. It's a company trying to make money, trying desperately in today's economy and literary environment, trying by hook or by crook to make money and to compete with digital and all of this stuff. And so one way to kind of think about this whole question is to picture the translators that are translating classic books or whatever as movie directors, and then think of publishers as like major studio franchises. So, think of it like Star Wars under the direction of Disney, as distributed by Disney, or Avengers as distributed by Marvel, right? And the analogy is actually pretty good because, from the studio and the franchise, if you think about something like Star Wars, right, the studio and the franchise tell you a little bit about the brand parameters. They tell you generally what kind of content to expect, the basic story elements, the typical narrative arc, the kind of product that this brand tends to put out. And the producer or the studio or the distributor really matters, right? Star Wars under Disney, Star Wars distributed by Disney, is different than Lucasfilm was before the Disney era. The Star Wars movies that have come out and TV shows and all those other properties that have come out with Disney at the helm have been Disneyfied. They've gone the same direction as Disney generally, right? They've been more woke, they've been more corporate, they've been kind of bland, a lot of them. And I mean, sorry if you love like Rey and the last trilogy or something, but I think we're all kind of universally agreed that those movies sort of suck, and they suck because of the branding problem, right? And because Disney has kind of made the whole series a little bit more bubblegum and a little bit less. I mean, it's not like Star Wars was ever the most edgy thing in the world, but it had this distinctive and kind of offbeat vision initially that made it what it was. And that's no longer true because the studio and the brand kind of gives you this general vibe that then gets applied to all the different products, whatever they may be, whether it's a TV show or a ride or a movie or a toy or whatever. But then within that broad territory and those brand parameters, right, you then get individual people commissioned to direct various movies, right? So Chris Nolan's Batman and Matt Reeves' Batman are not the same Batman movie because the directors also have their own brand. So they both come out with Warner Brothers, under Warner Brothers, but Chris Nolan, is the one with Christian Bale, and it's the famously sort of gritty and edgy and very kind of flashy new Batman that everybody sort of remembers. And then the Matt Reeves one is the one with Robert Pattinson, where we do a little bit more emo sad boy and we go into this sort of detective mode. And even the producers are different, right? Studio's the same, but the producers are different, the team's different. And so you get this particular spin that an individual director is going to put on the general brand. And at the intersection of that Venn diagram between the brand and the individual artists that they've commissioned to contribute to their brand, that's where you land on knowing basically exactly what to expect before you even go into the Zack Snyder DC movie, before you even go into the Christopher Nolan movie. You sort of know the original underlying IP, which in this metaphor would be the classic book in the original foreign language, but in the studio metaphor would be like the Disney's Star Wars or the general Batman universe or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or whatever. Then you have the artist, the individual artist who has his own kind of brand and style that's been commissioned. So the director, who in this metaphor would be the translator that the publisher has hired, but then you have the publisher themselves, right? That is also a brand, and they are like the studio, and they're going to kind of set the limits of how far the director can go into his particular weird idiosyncrasies and all of that stuff. Another way of looking at this that is more literary is to think about like a magazine and the writers that write for that magazine, right? So I, as a writer, have kind of like a brand, right? I have a loosely connected variety of tones. I have a particular voice and particular set of interests. But then those interests are going to intersect and overlap differently with different venues, different magazines or online websites that I'm writing for. And so I'm going to pick and select and emphasize different elements of my brand for Claremont Review of Books when I write an essay for them versus when I write an essay for Substack and I'm basically talking to you guys, right? To people that are here more for the fun Young Heretics vibe or whatever. And that kind of intersection is also what's going on when you're looking at a series of translations from a particular publisher. They're picking translators who have their own concerns, their own style, their own format that they tend to use, but those translators are then going to probably be constrained by the project that the publisher itself has undertaken. And that's how to think, I think, about these like larger series that we're dealing with. And it gives you this similar triad, right? The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the publisher, the original text, and then the mediator in between, which is the translator. And so what we're looking for here is rules of thumb to incorporate this third element, the publisher element, which is the industry element, right? The people that are most concerned about the bottom line and making a dollar and then selling you on their particular translation and minimizing their costs, right? That's what all businesses have to do. Publishers are no different. They have to do the same thing. So let's talk a little bit about the publishing industry, because if you're not in it, you may not have any reason to know that much about it. And it is an idiosyncratic industry, to say the least. And I am like an ink-stained wretch. I am no businessman. I am not speaking to you as an expert here, but I am speaking to you as somebody with some experience. I've worked with various different publishers throughout my career, published books at different places, published essays at different places. And I would say that one thing you absolutely have to know, everybody has to know when you're thinking about buying books or making books or whatever, that maybe not everybody does realize, is that academic publishing and what's called trade publishing, which is publishing for the general public, are totally different, and they run in totally different ways, and they're run by totally different people and kinds of people. And the results are therefore going to be different if you're going with a trade press, if you're buying something from a trade press versus if you're buying something from an academic press. They operate differently, and they attract and seek different kinds of talent, which means they're going to produce different kinds of translated editions. And there's tons of overlap in these two different ways, business models and people who operate in both universes, but they also are distinct and both produce translated editions. So I'm thinking, for example, right, of the Oxford World Classics, which I'll get into talking about what you can expect from them in a bit, but they're an example of Oxford University Press, a big but an academic publisher nonetheless, versus like Farrar, Straus Giroux, which is sort of a prestige imprint of Macmillan, this larger kind of big prestige publishing house. And an imprint is just like a sort of subcategory of a bigger publishing house that does a particular kind of thing. And so Farrar, Straus Giroux does put out some translations, but they're not the same kind of translations, the same kind of enterprise as you're going to get from an academic press. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you are writing for the trades, if you're writing for a trade publisher and trying to get published in, with a trade book, you typically, all else being equal, are going to start by writing up a book proposal, or even the book itself, or a sample chapter, or whatever, and trying to get an agent or a lawyer or somebody to represent you personally as the brand, as the individual legally. And then you're going to go to the publishers and try to sell the book to them. And then you're going to enter into a series of negotiations about money that will involve an advance, which is stuff they pay you upfront to write the book, and then royalties after that. So as the book sells and starts to make money, the publisher hopefully makes their money back. That's called earning out. And then you make your enough money to cover your advance, and then you start to earn like a little portion of every book that you sell. And sadly, the state of things is such that actually quite few books do earn out, do get start to make their money back, and then the author starts to get money. But everybody involved is trying to reach that point, right? Everybody is trying to reach a point where the writer is happy with the money that he's getting, and then the publisher is happy about the prospects of using the author's platform and their platform to start making royalties and start selling, going into the black essentially on the book. That's how trade publishing works, and it's very much kind of involved with people's egos and businesses, and it's run kind of like a business world. Academic publishing is totally different, and this even applies within publishing houses that have a trade wing and an academic wing. So I'm thinking of like Penguin or Bloomsbury, whom I wrote for Bloomsbury Academic. I have a book called Music in Ancient Greece, and that was published with Bloomsbury Academic. And Bloomsbury also publishes like Harry Potter, so totally different universe. And if you told people who have only ever worked in trade publishing their whole life about what goes on in academic publishing, they would think you were bananas. They would think it was insane, because academics are just different animals than, kind of jobbing, like popular writers. And they're much they have much, much lower expectations for getting paid. They're much more eager to get their work out in the world, irrespective of how much they get paid. And typically they just don't even have agents. And so typically it's just like assumed for both journal publishing and book publishing in academia that, you're probably not going to get an advance. You might make royalties if you make your money back. And academic publishers, in some sense, exist to publish books that very few people will read. And that's kind of alarming, but it's also the beautiful thing about them, right? It means that they can put out things that are like, just for specialists and are going to influence other stuff down the line, but aren't going to be bestsellers. Money is tight everywhere, but money is especially tight for these reasons in the academic world, because at least at a trade press, you can do things like you publish 50 Shades of Grey, right? You publish some big, trashy romance novel that makes $1 bajillion, and that will finance your kind of edgy, high-concept thriller for a year or whatever. It'll finance these other smaller projects that aren't going to make as much money. Academic presses, a lot of the time, can't do that. They can't finance their shop by, shilling for some trashy novel. They have to try to represent themselves and protect their brand as these very highfalutin sort of, organizations that only publish stuff of the finest and most pristine quality. Sort of like, there are some wine brands that can put out like a porch pounder and not damage their brand perception because, think of like Barefoot, right? They put out a bunch of different kinds of stuff, and some of it's super popular, some of it's not, but they can finance the less popular stuff with the more popular stuff. But a brand like Inglenook can't really put out something that's just okay, but largely popular, in order to finance weird other wines, because then they've diluted their brand, which is that of being an exceptionally high quality wine producer. And so academic publishers have sort of a different kind of game to navigate, and they're working with people who have less name recognition, fewer expectations, more collegiality, and more desperation. And so that's going to kind of produce a slightly different set of concerns, going to end you up with a different product. Now, how does all this work when it comes to translation? Well, the next thing you have to consider is that there's a matter of public domain and rights, right? So a new book, you have to buy the rights to the book. That's part of the publishing deal that you make, even if it's an academic press. But most of the stuff that you're going to be looking for translations for, most of the stuff that you would find in the Everyman Library or the, Harvard Classics series or whatever, is going to be in the public domain, which means that the rights to the original material are probably going to be free. Unless the copyright is being, really just stretched out by the estate or something, most things go into the public domain after like 70 to 95 years. So, within 100 years, you're pretty much safe, fair game. But that's not true of the translation. So if you were a Russian publisher and you wanted to just put out a new edition of Dostoevsky, it wouldn't be free, but the rights would, right? Because a lot of that stuff's public domain. If you are an English language publisher and you want to put out a new edition of Dostoevsky, you have to pay a translator if you want a new one, or you have to pick up an old translation that is just in the public domain. And this is where we start to understand the nature of a series like Everyman or like Harvard or, the classics of Western civilization or any number of these other things, these collections, right? Let's imagine that you are P.F. Collier and Son, which is the publisher that puts out the Harvard Classics series, sometimes known as the 5-foot shelf. They classically come in those green volumes, and you find them now basically like book sales everywhere. But this is like if you wanted, the must-read books, you might try to get the 5-foot shelf, the full set of Harvard Classics. Or let's imagine that you're Encyclopedia Britannica, which are the ones who put out the great books of the Western world, right? Or Everyman, or even you're the Loeb Classical Library, which is Harvard University Press, right? You want to create not just a good individual product, book by book, but you want to create a brand and a set that is a good product, right? That if somebody were to buy all of the great books of the Western world, they would feel satisfied in the variety, in the representative nature of the series that kind of covers basically Western history. And that's part of the satisfaction, right, of going to a brand like that. And even Everyman, which is, you're less likely to buy a full set of Everyman copies, but similarly, you do want like a sense that there's kind of a good variety, and any core text that you want, you can go and get from Everyman. And so you're one of these publishers, and you're thinking about curating that selection, and you want to add something new to your selection. But your budget's tight, and so you have to decide whether you're going to pay a translator to do something new, or whether you're just going to pick up a perfectly serviceable old translation, which many old translations are good. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing when you get a public domain translation, but public translations do go out of date because language changes. And so the ideal is always to get a really good cutting edge new translation. The reality is that's expensive. And this explains the quality of some of the translations that you will find in these wider, more general selections. I'm not saying all of them, but I am saying that it's why you can't just buy an Xbox and play all the different games that you want to play, right? And get everything you want out of this one brand. It's because each brand has to kind of balance its trade-offs and cut its losses and decide how it's going to spend its resources. So, with all of that having been said, you're not going to be able to just say, oh, it's this one or it's that one. But, of course, I have opinions. Because when do I not have opinions? And these sets that I've just mentioned, and I kind of listed, I think, the big ones, right? Harvard Classics, which is not put out by Harvard University Press, but P.F. Collier and Son. Great Books of the Western World, which is based on a University of Chicago course, but is not put out by University of Chicago, but Encyclopedia Britannica. And then Everyman. I think these are kind of the big ones that people tend to go to if they want like a big set that they can turn to. There are others, but these are the ones I'm most familiar with. And again, with the brand analogies, like this is kind of like Coke and Pepsi a little bit, where people like to get really, really intense about what amounts to quite small differences. And I am just the same. I have a definite preference, and it's Coke. I like Coke. Coke is obviously better than Pepsi. Anybody that disagrees with me can take it up with my lawyer. But similarly, or like the other comparison here is like these great sets of great books are like listicles before there were listicles. Because you know how when somebody makes a list of like the 10 best movies, part of the fun is like arguing over what they did and didn't put in and defending your own territory and your own personal favorites. And so I'm going to say that for me, like among these different options, Great Books of the Western World is just class. Like it's really hard to beat. If you want a full set, if you want to read through like a kind of basically freshman entry-level course in Western classics, like check out Great Books of the Western World. I would put that top of the list, including for translations and also for essays that they put out. Like all things being equal, it's not perfect. It's not going to give you the best available translation of everything that you would want, but it's always going to give you a decent translation and a cool essay and just a good, solid selection. You read through that, it's like taking a freshman level college course when freshman level college courses were good. And University of Chicago, actually, to be fair to them, have defended a lot of the stuff that has gone by the wayside in other universities. So just in general, right, based on, I think from the 1920s, a U of C course, that would be the one I would rank first. Then the Harvard ones, Harvard Classics. Then after that, Everyman, because I've really heard some rough stuff about some of the Everyman translations. Some of the reissue editions like get worse as they go along. Again, it's not like they're all terrible, and they are attractive editions, but I would just look into, try before you buy, right? Vet the translator and ask whether this is the Christopher Nolan Batman or whether this is the Robert Pattinson Batman before you buy just reflexively an Everyman translation versus like Classics of or Great Books of the Western World one, pretty solid, sort of reliable version. The Lobes are also great. The Harvard Classical Library, they're green and red, and every classicist has as many of them as he can possibly afford. But they're a slightly different animal because they're designed for armchair quarterbacking. So they're what's called a facing page or a bilingual edition. And this is true generally of bilingual editions, right? It's less of a problem if the translation is old or bad, because you're supposed to be looking at the original. You have the original on the other side of the page, and it's for people that have some Latin, some Greek, or even a lot of Latin, a lot of Greek, and just want the English there, but are able on their own to kind of check and see whether the translation is accurate. So I love a Loeb edition. I'm not alone in this. Like, they're really terrific and often very good. Not always, but often very good. And they've got a huge variety. But again, you're not going to turn to them probably if what you want is just an English edition of a Greek or a Latin text. So I would just put a footnote there. But I would say, that ranking is the one that I will defend, just as I will defend Coca-Cola over Pepsi, obviously. Now, that deals with kind of these, branded series, I think, that are designed to be taken as a whole or to be thought of as a whole product. And those really are the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff. This problem, however, of diversifying the offering and all of that becomes less acute when you start to deal with publishers that have not set themselves the task of arraying before you a curated selection that is supposed to be comprehensive of Western civilization or whatever else, because they don't feel quite as much pressure. I mean, they still do feel pressure to have a good selection and everything, but they're not going to just add something for the sake of having it in the collection. They're in the business of producing really good, reliable, usable, kind of layman's editions of classical texts. And for me here, the kind of big two are the Oxford classical texts and the Penguin Classics editions. Again, there are others. There's Signet, for example, right? But all of these, in my mind, sort of represent an attempt to bridge the gap a little bit between the academic publishing world and the trade publishing world by giving you mostly academics, experts in their field, translating stuff that people have a general interest in, but don't necessarily know how to read the scholarly literature about. And so if I want, just a solid kind of translation that I know I can use, that's going to be not necessarily luminous, but well footnoted, sizable, but not huge, affordable, just generally kind of handsome, I usually go to Oxford World Classics or to Penguin Classics. And that's typically kind of where I end up, because, they are larger publishing. Penguin, obviously, is a huge publishing house that are working with academics. And remember that academics are cheap, but nevertheless very knowledgeable, right? What they're not necessarily is great artists. And so some of these editions do have artistry in them, Robert Fagles is a great translator who's also an academic, translates the Theban plays for Penguin, that sort of thing. You do find others are just going to be kind of more workmanlike, but they're all going to get the job done. So if I have one answer to your question, Kevin, it's those two brands, the Oxford World Classics and the Penguin Classics, are pretty solid, pretty reliable go-tos. Again, you're going to get some duds in there. You're going to get some stuff that hasn't been updated for a while that's maybe not so good, but that's a pretty solid bet. And then if you want one level deeper into the weeds, I would say you should go with the Norton critical editions. I actually prefer those to any of the other stuff that I've mentioned, but that's because I'm a nerd and I want the big floppy, thin paper, small print with a million notes. But that's what they are. And so they might not be the most usable if you're just trying to if you're a weekend warrior, if you're just trying to recreationally sort of read and educate yourself and whatever, Norton might be kind of overkill, but maybe not. It straddles a line between real scholarly interest and kind of more general public interest. Any of those brands is going to give you a pretty decent, that's you can get an Xbox or you can get a PlayStation or you can get a Nintendo, you can get a Switch, I guess. But and you're going to get different products, and they're not going to have the same games, and some of them are going to be better to your more to your taste than others, but you're not going to go terribly wrong with any of them. Like, none of them is like the Sega Genesis. Sorry if any Sega fans out there. Each of those is going to serve you well. What they are not going to give you, and this is why the problem gets thorny. What they're typically not going to give you is like the celebrity big name poets who turn their hand to translation and then create some really splashy new fun edition of something. Now, I'm not saying that those are always the best translations. Sometimes you get one that's really kind of a dud, like, something that's trendy, but actually kind of not as good. I've talked before about how I don't really like Emily Wilson, but she falls into this category, right? I guess she is a scholar, but she's also, a huge name and a poet and all of this. And she's not going to go to like an academic press if she doesn't have to. Why? Because she doesn't want to get the like no advance deal. She doesn't need to do that. She's got this huge name recognition, and this goes for all these guys. Seamus Heaney, Aaron Puchigian, whoever. The kind of like artsy guys that are more artists doing translation than translators trying to be artful, aren't usually going to go into these series because they're going to engage in bidding wars with these big publishing houses, and then they're going to be spread throughout whichever publisher offers them the best, advance and everything, which means that they're going to be on there's going to be different ones on different gaming consoles, basically. And I, just to kind of make this point, I looked up some of my favorite splashy big name translations that I've used in the past. So, Stephen Mitchell's Gilgamesh is just amazing. And that's with Simon & Schuster. It's with Washington Square Press, which is this imprint of Simon & Schuster. But then Puchigian, whom I mentioned, who did this great Aristophanes translation, that's W.W. Norton. Seamus Heaney's Beowulf is Macmillan, Farrar, Straus Giroux, which I just mentioned earlier on. Simon Armitage, who's like a poet and a playwright, did this great Gawain and the Green Knight. That's with Faber. And so you see what I mean, that because of the economic concerns that go into, really famous authors translating or not translating, you're never going to end up with one publishing house that just brings them all under their wing and gives you like the quality lineup of everybody that you want to see. And so if what you're really looking for is just a dazzling translation of something that was like up to the minute by somebody that's just hugely respected, the chances are good that you're going to have to seek that person out or ask, write into me and ask about a particular text or whatever, because of the economics of the thing, because of how this tends to work out. So hopefully, even though I can't give you like a definite hard and fast answer about this, that is a helpful lay of the land and a helpful sort of translation cinematic universe. And if you take one thing away, it's that you'll never go wrong, really, with Oxford World Classics or with a Penguin. There's other stuff that will also steer you right, but I cannot give it the Clavin seal of approval. All I can say is that when a big publisher hires a famous person to do a new translation, it's at least bound to be interesting, even if it's a belly flop, which sometimes it is. So, go forth and adventure, but be aware that there be dragons. Okay, this was really fun and a different kind of thinking than perhaps we typically do on this show, but still relevant to the question of like, how do I pick good translations? If you have questions like that, send them to me. I love answering them if that's not clear. This one came via Substack DMs. I'm going to drop the link to my Substack in the show notes, and please do subscribe to that because there's all sorts of other benefits to it, but including you can be in the mailbag, write into me through DMs or email. I always love that. And I always love when you share the show. Retweet it, text your friends about it, give it 5 stars, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.